There are decisions that one makes throughout one's life. Our parents, our grandparents have made decisions, and that certainly has an impact on what we are and what we become.
If each person does what they can in their corner, we can make the world a better place. And I think House of Friendship has made our area a much better place for the disadvantaged people. And even for the people serving. I think all of us have learned to value human life.
And what I'm pleased to see is that we have found new and I would say better ways of relating to those persons in our community who benefit from our support.
House of Friendship is the experience of many people walking together and learning better ways to break the cycle of poverty for individuals and families. We talked with many former board members and staff who set the stage for where we are today.
Some women in Waterloo had an idea about starting a mission to the Jews. They were very passionate about that, and they prayed passionately. And suddenly they learned about this Jewish man who became a Christian, Joseph Kramer, and they really felt God had answered their prayers. C.F. Durstein, the pastor at First Mennonite Church, he also had an idea about a mission to Jewish people. But more importantly, as far as the House of Friendship founding was concerned, was the fact that Kitchener had a lot of transients, alcoholics, and immigrants from Eastern Europe.
Joseph Kramer was an evangelical Christian. He was always Jewish too. He had a great heart of compassion for the poor people. He would visit them on the weekend. If they needed anything like food or other things, he would give practically his last penny to help them.
Kramer was a very gentle, soft-spoken, small man. Bishop Durstein was this big, burly fellow with a deep voice and a commanding presence. And he managed to get support for this new venture to provide some food for the hungry people who were wandering around the streets of Kitchener.
Together we would prepare the meal, and the men and us would sit down at the same table and have our evening meal.
My father was a very strong supporter of House of Friendship, and I remember the early days when it first started. And as a matter of fact, I recall several of the clients of House of Friendship boarded at my parents' place back in the, would have been the 40s.
The House of Friendship was never a Mennonite ministry totally. It was ecumenical from the start, although the major players in the field and the major donations came from Mennonite churches.
I asked Mr. Kramer one time, there was a man who was always there. I said, why doesn't he go into an old folks' home? Oh, he said he'd lose his freedom.
Actually, Ilda Bauman was a part of this group that was praying in Waterloo. And so she was in on the House of Friendship from day one. When Joseph Kramer died and they needed to find a new director, that Ilda Bauman would have been a logical person to just assume that mantle. But she was a woman, and women didn't do that kind of thing. Durstein found a person in Toronto who was Jewish, had also become a Christian, and aside from that, he was totally unlike Kramer. He was much more like Bishop Durstein. House of Friendship by then, I believe, had moved to Charles, well, it's now Charles Street, it was then called Alma Street, into a house there, and he lived in that house upstairs. And he immediately expanded the program a lot.
23 Alma Street was a large, gracious home that had been adapted to the mission's work with homeless men and needy families. The clients, many of whom were transient men, would come in a separate entrance from the street and into the basement area where their dining room and sitting room was located.
There were a lot of meals having served at that time, like 900 a month was kind of the norm at that point.
Before or after the meals, the clients came up to the chapel on the main floor level from the basement, and there were services put on by either the staff or guest speakers and music groups, and the services were evangelistic. I came to the House of Friendship, a product of a Mennonite family and a Mennonite church community in a small village with a high percentage of Mennonite families. So my worldview was very limited, and the few years that I spent at 23 Alma Street were the beginning of a lifelong process of expanding that worldview.
Orville Yancey envisioned this ministry as kind of a rescue mission, and he came in and worked with alcoholics, and he always had to have a sermon before dinner at night.
There was a nightly service every night, and Orville often said, "I don't know why we have to have a service to feed hungry people." You know, he felt as though we were almost imposing on their rights, but that at the time was expected.
When Mabel Steinman was cook there, I would go down an odd night to help out. And one night there was an overflow. She had 2 tables of people, and there were people in there from Native people and people from the east and the north and the west, and she fed those dear people.
I do remember us getting these 4 dozen cold fried eggs. And I had a friend, she was older than I, but I would call her, "Now what'll I do with 4 dozen cold fried eggs?" So she told me, well, she put them in with fried potatoes. My mother used to do that, you know. And anyway, we had one man there. He could not digest the fried potatoes. So when he knew we were having them, he would go downtown. And then afterwards he said he met several of these men down the street, and they said they were good.
Orville allowed men to sleep at the House of Friendship, although it was not legalized hostel at that point.
It was amazing how the community and the churches supported the work. And with donations, financial and food donations, it never ceased to come.
That is, then I went to Kitchener on a Saturday morning, and first I met with the bishop alone. Then he recommended to the whole group that was there that I would be appointed as the next executive director. They had only one problem with me, believe it or not, is I was not married.
Up until his time, there was a fairly strong church involvement and getting church groups into, quotation marks, save these people at the home, and he kind of got away from that a little bit and said, hey, you know, this really isn't working. Let's put our efforts and our time into treating the people that are there and making their lives better.
While we were there, the House of Friendship went from a men's rescue mission, is the old name, and went into a social agency that was accepted by the whole community.
And it involved children and women and families. You're reaching out to the whole group, not just
the men
that had problems.
Financing was coming, a lot of it from the local churches, donations, and budget, I believe in '72 was certainly less than $200,000.
It was in 1973, in February, and I think at that point there was 5 other people that were working including the director and the cook.
When you looked at it, you thought, boy, these men must be pretty bad off. To go to a place like that, dormitory style, bunk beds piled one on top of the other, very crowded, but I guess it was better than the street. We started 174 because we noticed that how many alcoholics there were by that time in the city, not just at the House of Friendship, but also other places. And they needed a place where they are not just simply kept, but were treated.
There was that struggle at how much AA do you bring in to the program, how much do we develop our own unique program.
A lot of people with alcohol problems have psychological problems that they need to deal with underlying the alcoholism. Basically, the therapy helps a great deal with that. I know it did with my own case.
I was asked to be part of a small committee to develop Live and Learn. And I was involved with a lot of women who were on mother's allowance. And a lot of the women that I came in contact with were very isolated. A lot of them had issues of self-esteem. Many of them lacked some of the skills that we would have taken for granted. And it seemed that we could do something.
When we came to the House of Friendship, we were small, but by the time we left, we had grown in many areas. And we had a lot of respect from the whole community.
Came from families who could look after themselves and then come into that kind of a thing, that kind of a situation. But Jerry would soon set us straight, and he'd said that he would rather feed 5 people that didn't deserve it than have one do without. And I think that was a philosophy that I adopted shortly after I got on.
Martin was very careful in maintaining the values that had been really prevalent in the House of Friendship up to that time. The connections with the churches were strong. Connections with social service agencies were made stronger.
If you can gain people's trust and you have the credibility that they want to see, and that you make yourself as accountable as you can with their resources, then you have a whole new value superimposed upon the whole thing, and that value is just extremely powerful.
We contacted the House of Friendship at that point with ideas. For me specifically, it was doing repair work for housing. Martin Muir at the time was a very progressive director, and also the board was open to new ideas.
Very important thing for me was to watch Martin in action, how he planned and introduced the whole concept of a new hostel. And I was very glad that I was part of that.
I certainly remember moving to 63. It was a Saturday morning, it was a nice Saturday morning, and the hostel, of course, was closed to any services, and we were told to be sort of discreet when we moved the vault. And what happened is they placed the vault on a dolly and they rolled it down Charles Street, busy Charles Street, and everybody was watching and everybody knew that's the vault.
We had gone through a visioning program and put a number of charts up along the wall. And as a result of that, we opened the Kiwanis Youth Residence as well as the Kramer House Residence.
Just the development of our whole community centers program. I was involved in some of that, and just the way that evolved and how we were able to work with North Waterloo Housing and the City of Kitchener in terms of getting a unit at Chandler Moat initially for a community center, and then a facility from the City of Kitchener. And then that's grown into currently 4 community centers.
Even though we started Kramer House as a long-term housing for people who needed support, there was still need for more permanent housing. Waiting lists for coordinated access were really long. And so in the early 1990, I think it was, in 1990 we were able to build EB Village.
In 1996, House of Friendship and Alcontrol
a women's addiction treatment program in Waterloo amalgamated. Alcontrol became a program of House of Friendship, and so that was one difference. We went from just providing men's treatment to also offering a separate program for women.
We've been able to provide programs and settings where people who are really disconnected and alienated and lonely have been able to sort of develop some mini communities within our larger city community here. And not necessarily that faith has developed in those settings, but I think until you feel connected and feel good about yourself, it's often hard to even begin to think about faith issues.
Now, I had already known that other executive directors, there were some that were not Mennonite, so I felt okay with not being Mennonite. Being a woman in the position, I wasn't sure if the board would be ready yet for that, because that hadn't been part of their history. And I was delighted to see that they were ready to take that leap of faith. Growth has always been an interesting issue for House of Friendship. How do we sort of maintain this family sort of feeling of an organization and connectedness around the programs when we are adding in more and more programs?
Since I've been here, 23, 25 years, the group that I worked with the exception of a number that have been here and moved on, has been a basic group that have become more or less like family to me.
The thing that I've certainly been aware of is the change in the population in the region itself into a much more multicultural community, and we have certainly worked with many different people from all over the world in all our programs at House of Friendship. And that's been an exciting thing to see. I would say that probably when I started in '79, the majority of our volunteers were quite connected with the local church constituency that supported House of Friendship, and that still is an important piece. But we get volunteers sort of from all sectors of the community.
I think our biggest strength that we have in this agency that many agencies don't have is the faith community that supports us very strongly. And I think as long as we can keep ourselves true to our history, true to our faith, I think there's going to be a real future for helping people.
We used to deliver the Christmas hampers, and our kids were really small at that point, and we would take them along to deliver Christmas hampers. And you don't think that it has much of an impact other than they would say that they thought it was kind of boring when we were doing it. But there were a couple of years that we didn't do it, and they started questioning, why don't we deliver Christmas hampers anymore?
This story continues as board members, staff, volunteers, and participants walk and learn together, finding better and better ways to break the cycle of poverty in our region.